The 1920s, an era of seemingly unparalleled prosperity. For the first time, buying on credit gave Americans the opportunity to indulge in luxuries such as the Model T Ford, and created a facade of prosperity which epitomized the economic upturn of the era. However, beyond these superficial lifestyles, the 20s generated social conflict as moral sanctity strove to regulate Americans' lives. Flappers emerged as a rebellious counterculture by dressing provocatively and defying traditional values. The 18th Amendment, which meant to prohibit the sale of alcohol, instead provoked crime and corruption and left a violent mark in many urban areas. Crime-ridden cities like Chicago toiled with murders and kidnappings, which had become commonplace. However, one brutal murder shocked the nation in particular and demonstrated the double nature of the 1920s. In May of 1924, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, two wealthy Chicago teens, randomly kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old boy. The crime proved tragic because it had gone beyond the limits of America's defiant youth. Attorney Clarence Darrow took on the case and focused its controversy onto his beliefs on the death penalty. By proving it unreasonable to sentence two young boys to death, he triumphed over conventional thought and drew the nation's attention to the morality of capital punishment.
Jacob Franks was a wealthy businessman and former head of a successful pawn shop. He, his wife Flora, and their 3 children lived in a large mansion in the prestigious Kenwood neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Crime and violence was almost unheard of in this middle-class neighborhood, which is why the Franks were not at all concerned when their son Bobby was late for dinner on May 21, 1924. They received a phone call later that night from a George Johnson. Their son had been kidnapped. A ransom note followed the next afternoon, demanding $10,000. However, the captors would never receive the ransom. Bobby's naked body had been discovered earlier that day in a culvert at Wolf Lake near the Illinois-Indiana border, his face disfigured with hydrochloric acid. The only clue left at the scene was a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. Only 3 pairs had been sold in Chicago, and after further investigation, police brought in 19-year-old Nathan F. Leopold for questioning. According to his alibi, he had dropped the glasses while birdwatching at Wolf Lake with his friend Richard Loeb. The 2 boys did not fit a murderer's profile. Both attended the University of Chicago and came from wealthy Jewish families that resided in the Kenwood neighborhood. Nathan was a bright 19-year-old student and spoke 5 languages fluently. He had a keen interest in ornithology and appeared in a documentary about a rare species of bird. Richard Loeb was the son of the vice president of Sears, Roebuck & Company and was quite popular on the college campus. The families of the 2 boys denied the allegation that their sons could be murderers. But to their surprise, on May 30th, after 12 hours of interrogation, Leopold and Loeb separately confessed to the crime. On the afternoon of May 21st, they circled around Harvard School in a rented car, looking for a victim. They randomly lured Bobby Franks and bludgeoned him to death with a chisel, simply for the thrill of it. Their plan was to lead the boy's father on a wild goose chase before receiving the ransom. In their mind, they had concocted the perfect crime, a meticulous scheme impossible to figure out. Chicagoans were stunned. The Tribune devoted practically their whole news section to the story, establishing the crime as unique in Chicago's annals and unprecedented in American criminal history. The public was astonished that 2 wealthy and respectable teenagers could kill a young boy and think they could get away with it. The arbitrary choice of victim made the crime especially tragic.
People were shocked by the nature of this crime. I think that a lot of parents of the age were sent into a panic about the safety and protection of their children at the time.
On June 1st, the Chicago Herald and Examiner stated, "We have striven to free our youth. We have permitted and encouraged the casting off of restraints. And 2 of the most gifted and brilliant products of this mindset are charged with the most revolting crime of the century." Americans came to view the murder as one symptomatic of the decade. Many felt the crime was an extreme case of misguided youth, of whom Leopold and Loeb were 2 perfect examples. In an era of radical change and prosperity, the agreeable and intellectual prominence of 2 young boys was overshadowed by a dangerous combination of desire, thrills, and crime. The tragedy of Bobby Franks' murder was a product of the 1920s. The trial of Leopold and Loeb began on Monday, July 21, 1924, before Judge John Caverly. Attorney Robert Crowe represented the prosecution, while the families of the two boys hired acclaimed Chicagoan attorney Clarence Darrow for the defense. Darrow was a radical lawyer who had saved over 100 clients from the death penalty during his career, and although he was near retirement, he took on the case as a platform for his lifelong crusade against capital punishment. In his defense for Leopold and Loeb, he switched the plea to guilty at the preliminary hearing. This way, Darrow could argue the morality of putting two young boys to death instead of trying to prove their innocence. Crowe opened for the prosecution on July 23rd. Taken by surprise by the sudden change in plea, he hoped to prove that the murder was so brutal, Leopold and Loeb were worthy of no other punishment besides death. He called a total of 81 witnesses for the state, giving a detailed account of the gruesome murder of Bobby Franks.
Darrow, on the other hand, appealed to Caverly's humanity. He emphasized Leopold and Loeb's young age and reasoned that the crime was a senseless act of immature children, moved by some emotion that we still perhaps have not the knowledge or insight of life to understand. He relied on a psychiatric examination of the two boys, which found that their motive to kill was hidden in their childhood imaginings and unconscious instincts. The psychiatric report reasoned that the crime was the inevitable outcome of a curious coming together of two pathologically disordered personalities. Darrow closed for the defense with an emotional speech. He declared the fate of Leopold and Loeb entirely in the hands of Judge Caverly, who would have to turn his back on every precedent of the past, and ignore all sentiment and feeling to sentence two young boys to death. After 3 weeks of deliberation, Caverly returned on September 10th with a verdict. Moved solely by the defendant's youth, he sentenced Leopold and Loeb to life plus 99 years in prison.
Leopold and Loeb had escaped the noose. Caverly sentenced them to life at the Illinois State Penitentiary solely on the grounds of their youth. In spite of the strong public sentiment against the two boys, Darrow was able to manipulate the fervor of capital punishment with rational psychiatric evidence and defy a trend of harsh conservatism in the courtroom. Although Caverly denied Darrow's use of psychiatric evidence as a factor in his decision, such testimony was used for the first time in a mitigation and would be mimicked in future cases. The public's attention, however, was concentrated on the fate of the murderers, as most Americans disagreed with the verdict. The Kansas City Star commented, "Society looks to the courts for protection, but the court failed in its duty." The American public felt Leopold and Loeb escaped hanging because of their family's wealth, and were concerned about their possible parole in the future. However, extensive newspaper coverage of the trial gave Darrow the notoriety that would help continue his campaign against capital punishment.
In a statement following Caverly's verdict, Darrow reflected, "I have always hated capital punishment. This decision at once caps my career as a criminal lawyer and starts my path in another direction." A month after the end of the trial, Judge Alfred J. Talley of New York challenged Darrow to a debate on the capital punishment. Darrow refuted Talley's traditional points, asserting that the state teaches people to kill. Darrow's reasoning seemed to promote a movement against the death penalty, as a year later, the American League to Abolish Capital Punishment was formed in an effort to create state abolition groups across the nation. Executions plummeted from 1,500 in the 1920s alone to some 200 between 1960 and 1980, at which point a series of groundbreaking Supreme Court cases were being heard on the issue. Furman v. Georgia, as well as Gregg v. Georgia, limited the application of the death penalty, and in the 70s and 80s, 37 states enacted new death penalty laws, 17 currently having no death penalty statute. The influence of abolitionists during the early 1900s proved to be significant, and indicated a struggle for reason which had triumphed even through the Leopold and Loeb trial. The kidnapping and murder of Bobby Franks had set off a chain of events that would forever impact America. Through this tragic case of misguided youth during the 20s, Clarence Darrow was able to manipulate the fervor of capital punishment that surrounded the trial into a moral issue which he himself believed the nation needed to address. He succeeded in encouraging an open forum for capital punishment, despite the circumstances of the 20s, and brought about a modern mentality which declared that law should be based on reason instead of traditional passions of a Victorian America. Darrow championed reason through his involvement in a moral issue during the 20s, and the nation followed soon after by re-examining the death penalty in a new light.